Hi, everybody. Welcome in. It is great to be back for another episode of Jane Austen and Company. I posted a question in the chat asking where you all are joining from, and I'm seeing some wonderful responses so far. So we've got folks joining from Orlando, Florida, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Chicago. We have friends of Jeff are here in attendance. That's wonderful. So please, as you're entering in, we would love for you to post a comment, share where you're joining from. Here at Jane Austen & Co., we try to really cultivate a lot of global connections to Jane Austen. So we typically have a few international attendees, so far mainly stateside. Evanston, lots of Illinois in the crowd tonight. I wonder why. All right. Los Angeles, Fayetteville, North Carolina, Texas. All right, a fellow Texan. I'm joining from Abilene, Texas, where the temperature yesterday was 65 and it dropped down to 20 today. It was very chilly. Wonderful. Keep sharing where you're from. I'm loving this. We've got a good crowd here joining tonight.
I'm looking at Phoenix and thinking, yes, I was there about a week ago. It was lovely.
Wonderful. Well, good. We are going to go ahead and get started. And as you join again, please share where you're joining from. Finally, an international response.
It's Julian Dooley from Australia.
Wonderful. And how timely that is, because we're about to introduce a brand new series featuring, in part, Jillian. But without further ado, let me get the things kicked off tonight. My name is Eric Bontempo. I'm joined tonight by my fellow co-host, Susan Allen Ford. Our technical directors this series are Nadea Pugh, who has been a longtime technical director, and we're joined tonight by Maisie Ferguson, who this is her first time technically directing an episode of JA & Co. Maisie is a music major and English major at the University of Kansas, and we're thrilled that she is here joining us tonight for Jane Austen & Co. For the past 5-6 years, I've lost count at this point, Jane Austen & Company has been steadfast in providing Jane Austen content in a virtual format. And we've kind of gone back and forth between in-person events and in virtual formats. And we really do find that virtual formats allow us greater accessibility. We can do some really cool things, including a brand new series that Susan is going to introduce.
Yes. Tonight, we're beginning our new series, Music and the Regency. During the next 2 months, 4 scholars will provide widely different perspectives on this subject. Music making and music appreciation could be complicated, even contested activities during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. We're going to look at aspects of public music and domestic music, and even sometimes zero in on Jane Austen's own musical experience. Each presentation will include a musical delight. Our first speaker, Jeff Nigro, tonight is going to discuss an aspect of public music making, male castrati and their female fans. On March 6th, Julian Dooley will discuss music in Austen's life and work, including some of what she played and sang. Next, on March 20th, we'll hear from Catherine Libben, who will move outward to women and musical education during this period. And finally, on April 10th, Laura Klein will discuss the evolution of keyboard music during this period and consider the music that Austen was practicing while she was writing. This series promises to be a really exciting one.
Awesome. And you can see on these flyers our website address. So please visit our website to get more information on the entire slate of speakers for this series. Our website is janeaustenandco.org. And again, our next event is in a couple weeks on March 6th. In addition, I want to take a few minutes to advertise the 2025 Jane Austen Summer Program. The Jane Austen Summer Program, or JASP, is part of Jane Austen Collective. So we have a close partnership there. As I'm sure you all know, 2025 is the 250th birthday of Jane Austen, and so JASP is celebrating the occasion with a special version of the Jane Austen Summer Program taking place this time in New Bern, North Carolina, with a theme of sensibility and domesticity. During our 4-day symposium, we'll explore topics that include medicine, birth, and domestic arts in Regency England and colonial North Carolina. We'll be focusing on Austen's first published novel, Sense and Sensibility, considering the birth of her career as a published writer, as well as taking a look at the transatlantic connections that exist. Our website, janeaustensummer.org, contains information about registration, travel, accommodations, and more. We traditionally host JASP in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, but thanks to a generous grant from the North Carolina Humanities Foundation, we're able to take JASP on the road this summer to, again, explore those colonial connections in a unique way. New Bern is home to Tryon Palace, where North Carolina's first governor had his mansion. And the coastal location is perfect for exploring the relevance of the Navy and the sea to Austen's novels as well. Some additional announcements. We've talked about JASP. We're here for Jane Austen & Co. I also want to briefly mention Jane Austen's Desk, which is a digital humanities venture that we've started. This is the last week to enter the JAD contest. So do you want to offer helpful feedback on a really new, cool website while earning a chance to win prizes? If you register for JASP, so those who register for JASP and who complete a user experience will be entered into an exclusive raffle. And you can visit the website, and it's listed here on this slide as janeaustensummer.org/JAD, or you can scan this QR code to enter. And again, those prizes are all related to JASP. This contest does close in just a couple days on February 21st. So if you're going to enter, try to do so very soon. And we thank you in advance for all of your help.
And now I'm excited to introduce tonight's speaker. Jeffrey Nigro has had a professional relationship with the Art Institute of Chicago for over 30 years, including serving as director of adult programs in the Department of Museum Education from 2003 to 2010. He's currently a research associate in the arts of Greece, Rome, and Byzantium, and an adjunct lecturer in the Department of Interpretation at the Art Institute. He also teaches adult education seminars at the Newberry Library, and he's a former regional coordinator of JASNA's Greater Chicago region. He's published many essays on art and music during Jane Austen's lifetime in Persuasions and Persuasions Online. And his essay, Georgian Fangirls, Women and Castrati in 18th Century London, appears in Women and Music in the Age of Austen, edited by Linda Ziankowski and Miriam Hart. Oh, okay. It's a really beautiful book and a very interesting essay.
All right. Before Jeff begins his talk, our technical director, Maisie, is going to explain how you in the audience can send in questions during and after his presentation.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to YouTube, our streaming platform. If you'd like to leave a comment or ask a question, please use the comment feature on the sidebar. We'll collect your comments throughout the performance, and during the Q&A after the performance, Jeff can answer them. So please get those questions and comments in. We love hearing from you. You will need to log into your Google or YouTube account to post the comment feature on the sidebar. But if you do not have a Google or YouTube account, that is okay. You can submit your questions to info@janeaustenandco.org, and we'll collect questions from there and ask them for you. And I will post that in the chat as well for easy access.
Wonderful. All right. And now, without further ado, we present Jeff Nigro and his presentation on Georgian fangirls, women, castrati, and gender in late 18th century London. Take it away, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you for hosting this event. Thank you to Susan Allen Ford for inviting me to speak on this series. and for the lovely introduction. I am really thrilled to be part of this series, especially among so many other distinguished speakers who have been part of this series for Jane Austen and Company, and for the outstanding music historians who are giving some of the rest of the talks for the rest of this particular series about music and the Regency. I feel like the sort of the cuckoo in the nest because I'm an art historian, but also a dilettante when it comes to music, which since I'm talking about dilettantes in a way, it's appropriate. And I also do have to give a shout out to Linda Ziankowski and Miriam Hart, our valiant, stalwart, and supportive co-editors for the volume. And here it is again. Women in Music in the Age of Austen, in which my talk is based on my essay that appears in that volume. So if we're ready to pull up the presentation, I can begin. Thank you, Maisie. I also want to thank Maisie and Nadea for the outstanding technical assistance. So I understand that there might be people who bristle slightly at the use of the word fangirl. It seems very trendy, and I'm the least trendy person on the planet, so I understand. But I have a reason for using it, and I'll sort of go into that a little bit later in the talk. But this is Georgian Fangirls, Women, Castrati, and Gender in Late 18th Century London. So next slide, please. In May 1790, the Italian-born British artist Mariah Hadfield Cosway left London, where she had resided for more than a decade, for a trip to the European continent. Leaving behind her husband, the artist Richard Cosway, and their daughter Louisa, who was then only a few weeks old. Cosway apparently traveled in the company of her brother, the architect George Hadfield, and her friend Lady Wright. Cosway's sudden departure excited considerable comment from her many well-connected friends. Horace Walpole wondered how Mariah Cosway could quote, drop a child and her husband and country all in one breath, end quote. However, some contemporary gossip, next slide, please, and many subsequent commentators have suggested that Cosway traveled with or in the wake of the castrato Luigi Marchesi, an Italian opera star who had just completed a spectacular and highly lucrative 2-year engagement at the King's Theatre in the Haymarket, the home of Italian opera in London. What exactly was the relationship between Mariah Cosway and Luigi Marchesi? Were they lovers, as many of their friends assumed? As we'll see, the suggestion is not as outrageous as it might seem despite Marchesi's status as a castrato. Or was Cosway the 18th century equivalent of a groupie? A talented musician and lover of music as well as a gifted visual artist, Mariah Cosway represents a new kind of opera fan. Not a woman from the elite classes who officially patronized the opera, but one whose appreciation of great singing was knowledgeable and genuine. In this, she was not alone. Next. Other prominent examples include the novelist Frances Burney D'Arblay, one of Jane Austen's favorite novelists, as we know, and her sister, the diarist Susan Burney Phillips, the daughters of the musicologist Dr. Charles Burney. Susan Burney, in particular, has been described by Curtis Price, Judith Milhouse, and Robert Hume as, quote, a marvelous commentator on music, knowledgeable, sensitive, enthusiastic, and musically educated, end quote, whose talents made her, quote, no doubt a decidedly atypical member of the audience, end quote. True as this statement might be, the Burney sisters, like Mariah Cosway, represent a kind of admirer of musical talent and charisma that today's audiences can recognize. They're the spiritual ancestors of today's fangirls. Next. The castrato had been the most spectacular and the most problematic phenomenon in 17th and 18th century opera, also known as musici or evirati, an Italian word literally meaning unmanned men, emasculated men. Castrati had been castrated before puberty to preserve their treble voices. Now, I realize, of course, that there are all kinds of moral issues with castrati and castration, etc. But I want to acknowledge those without necessarily going into them because I really don't have the time to do it. I think that for our purposes this evening, it's best to just assume, that sort of take it as a given that castrati are singing in opera. With their haunting timbres, rigorous musical training, and phenomenal techniques, castrati filled church choirs all over Italy and beyond, and the greatest of them dominated the opera stages of Europe for more than 2 centuries. The castrato as operatic hero and romantic leading man spread throughout Europe along with the genre of what we tend to call Italian opera seria, serious opera. At the time, it was usually called drama per musica, that showcased the castrato's talents. Next slide. Castrati were stars in Britain as well. The vogue for Italian opera, fashionable among the British elite for a variety of social and cultural reasons, survived both the financial volatility of maintaining an inherently expensive art form and ambivalent attitudes towards Italian opera itself. As you can see in this cartoon, John Bull is at the Italian opera, bluff-hearty Englishman yawning and not knowing how to deal with this. The singer on stage is, I suspect, intended to be, and I'm not alone in this, suspecting to be a castrato because he's very tall and broad-chested and has this sort of very boyish face. These ambivalent attitudes, as I mentioned, toward Italian opera itself, as Gillen Darcy Wood maintains, quote, the King's Theatre Opera House, the most important in Europe outside Italy, embodied a multitude of perceived dangers to the English nation: effeminacy, cosmopolitanism, luxury consumption, the tyranny of fashion, and a thriving aristocratic culture of patronage, end quote. The fact that the biggest stars of the Italian opera were castrated men only added to the ambivalence surrounding Italian opera in Britain. Italian opera and the singers performing it may well have appealed to people of a range of genders and sexualities in London, if not a range of social classes, as opera tended to be elitist and expensive. But the relationships between castrati and their female admirers are particularly fascinating, given the perceived gender and sexuality issues surrounding the castrati themselves, especially during the second half of the 18th century, when the castrati were increasingly viewed as freaks. I don't propose that there are any essential, or to be more precise, essentialist differences between how women and men respond to music and singing. Rather, I want to focus on the responses of women to opera singers at a time when opera seems to have provided women with an intellectual and emotional outlet not always available to them. Next slide. According to a notorious and often repeated anecdote, at the 1734 London debut of Farinelli, perhaps the greatest and certainly the most famous castrato of them all, one woman is said to have shouted, "One God, one Farinelli." Despite the fact that this anecdote has been requoted in so much of the literature on castrati, it's virtually impossible to determine whether there is any truth to it or to trace it back to any one original source. Even in our days of celebrity culture, this gushing, adoring, and especially in the context of its time, quasi-blasphemous utterance seems excessive. Why are people so quick to believe that it was uttered by a woman? As we'll see, the devotion of female fans to castrati cannot be so easily dismissed as simple, rapturous adoration. So this is why I wanted to use the word fangirl, but I'm using it sort of ironically. Fangirl, like its related word fanboy, is a way of infantilizing admirers of great performers, making them sound like emotionally immature perpetual adolescents. It's all about their adoration and sexual attraction, as if you can't engage your emotions, your desires, and your intellect all at the same time. My point is that the women I'm talking about are all outstanding examples of a complete, mature, and sophisticated engagement with their favorite singers. I just want to take fandom seriously, and particularly these women fans who knew what they were listening to. Next, please. From the 1770s onward, the castrato phenomenon began a gradual decline. The final decades of the century witnessed the last flourishing of the castrati as opera stars, though they continued in church choirs until much later and in the Sistine Chapel choir until the early 20th century. Many of the most celebrated castrati of the late 18th century appeared to great acclaim in London. Gaspare or Gasparo Pacchierotti, Giovanni Rubinelli, and the aforementioned Luigi Marchesi. These are all caricatures again, but it gives you a sense of their charisma and what they were best known for, as well as their physiques. And a number of factors led to the decline of the operatic castrato. The rise of an Enlightenment rationality that increasingly considered the practice of castration to be barbaric, the shift toward a more binary notion of gender, accentuating the attacks on the effeminacy of castrati, and changing operatic tastes, as opera seria came to be seen as excessively codified and old-fashioned, and female stars, followed eventually by tenors, began to eclipse the castrati in popularity. The gradual disappearance of castrati from opera is clear in retrospect, but it was apparent even at the time. Next. There's no question that, broadly speaking, Enlightenment science played a role in the declining cultural prominence of castrati as paradigms of sexuality were beginning to change. And this, I draw on the magisterial work of both Martha Feldman and Roger Freitas, talking about the castrati and gender. Both Feldman and Freitas are influenced by the admittedly controversial views of Thomas Laqueur, detailing a watershed moment somewhere around 1750 between the old Galenic one-sex model and the newer Enlightenment gender binary model. Moving from, in the Galenic model, it had to do with the child in the womb. The way I like to describe it is that when you were a bun in the oven, if you came out fully baked, you came out as a boy, and if you came out partially cooked, you came out as a girl. That's the way they used to think about it in this ancient Galenic model. And then the newer Enlightenment model, in which basically men and women are seen as opposed and often irreconcilable binaries. Having been castrated before puberty, castrati were able to preserve something of their boyish appearance throughout their lives. And so if the ideal of beauty is the boy somewhere between man and woman, then this beauty of both sound and person come together in the figure of the castrato. The difficulty of defining the gender of the castrati is complicated by the erotic allure of their voices as well as their bodies. And so I should note here too that when I was speaking about individual castrati, I follow the practice of the 18th century and more recent scholarship of using he, him pronouns to describe them. Of course, we don't know how castrati would choose to be identified today. Next, please. By most accounts, the castrato voice combined childlike purity with quote-unquote masculine power and feminine tenderness. In short, castrati apparently did not sound precisely like women or like the falsettists and countertenors who often take their roles today and sing their music, but rather like a combination of men, women, and children. I just put a bunch of random covers from CDs from recent years of both male and female artists performing music written for castrati, men using falsetto typically. And some of these are homages to specific castrati, some are more general celebrations of them. And this whole issue with castrati and gender is even more complicated by the fact that very often women sang male characters in 18th century opera. This was very common. And there were certain places such as Rome and the Papal States and Portugal in which women were forbidden to appear on the stage. And so female characters in opera were taken by castrati. And in fact, in Rome, there were some singers who kind of specialized, castrati who specialized in playing female characters, sort of like the Yonagata of Kabuki theater. They're recording at the top right on the slide of Bruno de Sa's Roma Travestita is a series of arias written for female characters that were originally sung by castrati in the 18th century. So there's all of this sort of gender fluidity going on, which is very characteristic of opera of this period. This combination of feminine and masculine tones may well have contributed to the castrato's erotic allure, just as their bodies and physical appearance often did. Next. In a culture that prized reserved, genteel behavior in women, female fans might have been unwilling to put erotically charged feelings into words outside of their own private diaries or speculatively off-the-record conversations with other devotees. Francis Burney, speaking about the singing of the castrato Giuseppe Milico, says, next slide, that his singing filled her, quote, with rapture. My terms are strong, and yet they but weakly express my meaning. Never have I known pleasure so exquisite, so heartfelt, so divinely penetrating as this sweet singer has given me, end quote. I should say the italics here are Burney's. Patricia Howard, quoting these passages, concludes that Burney's, quote, reaction to Milico's singing was outspoken and plainly implies sexual attraction, end quote. But again, it's the relationship to voice and body, and there's an attitude of perceiving castrati as having sort of strange, monstrous bodies in the 18th century, but also conversely an appreciation of the physical beauty of some of them. Recent studies have demonstrated that the castrati's very physiques often enhance their attractiveness both on and off the stage. Martha Feldman argues convincingly that there is not such a thing as a single castrato body type. It depended on so many aspects of physiology about when castration occurred and all kinds of other issues. The physiological effects of castration, compounded by the effects of intensive training and years of heroic singing, were often exaggerated by the artists visually representing castrati. You see in the next slide, you can see that castrati were often appear in caricatures as terrifyingly tall and outrageously barrel-chested with tiny pin heads. Ironically, these physical traits contributed to the castrati's tonal power and astonishing breath control, their large kind of expanded chests. Again, I'm an art historian, not a doctor, so I can't really address the physical medical reasons for a lot of these developments, but they seem to be fairly common. And in the next slide, you'll see two other caricatures. You can see the castrato Nicolino, who looks quite large and fleshy, which is very typical for a lot of castrati and these large sort of thick legs. But on the right, Farinelli appears in this cartoon as extremely tall and extremely thin, and the satirical verse underneath the image begins, "Thou tuneful scarecrow." But not all castrati were seen as monstrous. Quite a few of them were celebrated for their physical beauty, and Luigi Marchesi was one of them. Next slide. Marchesi's handsomeness is attested by a portrait of him by none other than Richard Cosway, husband of Mariah, a portrait now known through engravings. Even male opera lovers commented on Marchesi's good looks. Charles Burney, father of Francis and Susan, remarks on besides his vocal powers, his performance on the stage is extremely embellished by the beauty of his person and grace and propriety of his gestures, also noting his elegant figure and pleasing countenance. Some observers seem to have found Marchesi's physical beauty difficult to reconcile with their perception of castrati as freaks. Next slide. In 1791, this is quoting Martha Feldman, in 1791, a Venetian Filarmonico music lover named Innocenza della Lena jumped through hoops to find physical fault with Luigi Marchesi, for, as he put it, despite outer appearances that Marchesi was handsome and regular in his features, quote, nature will not give up her rights, end quote. In any case, Marchesi's handsomeness seemed to have appealed to his fans, especially his female ones, at least as much as his dazzling singing did. Feldman argues that castrati were not viewed as non-men, simply as non-generative. The sacrifice of their virility and fertility for a higher purpose, music, particularly since the castrati began as and continued to be church singers, was considered comparable, in Italy at any rate, to the celibacy of Roman Catholic priests. Moreover, their singing was often compared to that of angels, also conventionally gendered as male, but paradoxically considered higher beings than humans. Of course, there were also decidedly non-spiritual reasons why so many Italian parents had their sons castrated, most notably the prospect of fame and fortune, in the hope that these men's sacrifice could subsequently guarantee the financial prosperity of the entire family. Next slide. Eventually, however, the interaction of Enlightenment scientific and anthropological discoveries with changing notions of gender affected attitudes toward the castrati. Here in this famous painting by William Hogarth from the Marriage a la Mode series, you can see a singer at left with an open music book accompanied by a flautist. This singer is generally taken to be a castrato. It's been described as a portrait either of Senesino, Handel's great castrato, Farinelli, or Giovanni Caristini, another great singer. He looks more like Senesino to me than anyone else, but I think he's clearly meant to be a castrato. And just over his head on the wall above him is a painting of the abduction of Ganymede. And this is the mythological story about Zeus or Jupiter taking a break from basically, preying on females. Jupiter falls in love with this beautiful young man, Ganymede, and has his eagle bring Ganymede up to Mount Olympus to serve as Jupiter's cupbearer. This is a story which is a story about homosexuality, and the painting here in the juxtaposition of it with the singer seems to imply homosexuality, or at the very least effeminacy, to use an old-fashioned term. There's no evidence that castrati were any more likely to be homosexual than the population in general, but this was often an attitude taken towards them. And you can see just to the left of center of the composition, a woman in white who is just swooning over the singing of this castrato, ignoring the actual cupbearer, the servant or perhaps enslaved person, who is handing her a cup of coffee or chocolate. Again, as the century wore on, castrati came to be seen by many British observers as a threat to both nationhood and manhood, as Darcy Wood puts it. Despite such attacks, the castrati appealed to admirers across the spectrums of genders and sexualities. This appeal was intensified by a transgressive aura that made them irresistible both on and off the stage. Furthermore, their castrated state did not necessarily preclude sexual activity. In most cases, the castration process involved the crushing or removal of the testicles, but the process left the penis intact, and for many castrati, sexual arousal was still possible. It's true that in an age with no genuinely reliable birth control, castrated males were the safest type of lover for women seeking to avoid the scandal of unwanted pregnancies, but the prospect of having an intimate relationship with a superstar must have been attractive then as now. Some castrati, such as Gaetano Guadagni and Venanzio Rossini, had reputations as womanizers. There was also a further ambivalence about castrati beyond their sexual status and gender identity. Next slide, please. The anxieties about Italian opera that Gillian Darcy Wood describes in the excerpt I quoted earlier are also closely tied to what he has labeled virtuosophobia. And that's illustrated here with this caricature of another famous castrato, Antonio Bernacchi, unleashing a torrent of notes that sort of vaults over the very tall campanile or bell tower in the Piazza San Marco in Venice. This virtuosophobia Wood describes as a fear of the kind of self-indulgent technical virtuosity and bravura that had become the castrato stock in trade. The antidote to this perceived mechanical singing was sensibility. Next slide, please. The refined and tender feelings that were often gendered as feminine and to which women were considered particularly susceptible. As Janet Todd puts it, quote, the cult of sensibility stressed those qualities considered feminine in the sexual psychology of the time: intuitive sympathy, susceptibility, emotionalism, and passivity, end quote. Sensibility is often considered to be complementary to Enlightenment rationalism, but the cult of sensibility arguably enhanced the prestige of castrati at a time when that prestige was being undermined by Enlightenment rationalism. Chloe Chard argues that, quote, the cult of sensibility made the gracefully nuanced emotional range of the high voice particularly appropriate to express the tender effusions of a lover, end quote. You would think that this sensibility, allegedly so appealing to women, would then serve to make castrati more appealing to their female fans, or at least that would be the stereotype of the time. But it's more complicated than that. Like most singers of the time, castrati were trained in both florid bravura singing and the more haunting lyrical kind of singing that was expressive of pathos. In fact, the two styles kind of work together in tandem very often, although singers were often stereotyped as being one or the other. Pacchierotti, who we'll see again, was seen as the singer of pathos, and Marchesi as the singer of dazzling vocal display. Next slide, please. This is a caricature of Pacchierotti and a female singer. This is Italian affectation, real characters. In his musical reminiscences, next slide, please, Richard Edgecombe, second Earl of Mount Edgecombe, recalled that although Pacchierotti was more than capable of bravura vocal fireworks, quote, the chief delight of singing and his own supreme excellence lay in touching expression and exquisite pathos, end quote. Mount Edgecombe compares the relative talents of Pacchierotti, whom he describes as all feeling, and Luigi Marchesi, who is all fire. Certainly, this kind of oversimplification of the artistic abilities of performers can be reductive, but it suggests that fiery singing could be as attractive to a susceptible music lover as the pathetic variety. Pacchierotti actually gets immortalized by Frances Burney. Next slide, please. In Chapter 8, an opera rehearsal of Frances Burney's novel Cecilia, or Memoirs of an Heiress of 1783, which readers of Jane Austen know. Austen refers to, or her narrator refers to, in Northanger Abbey as one of the exemplars of the novel. And in this chapter, Cecilia, the heroine, and her friends go to an opera rehearsal where Pacchierotti is singing, and he is named as such. And Cecilia is deeply moved by his singing, and her shallow, fashionable friends make fun of her for being so emotionally susceptible to the music. Next slide, please. Possibly Pacchierotti's greatest admirer in London, though, was Frances's sister Susan Burney. Certainly, Susan Burney's journals reveal her to be not only a knowledgeable and enthusiastic admirer of Pacchierotti's artistry, but also a warm personal friend. Linda Kelly's reading of Burney's journals clearly indicates an intense fondness between the two. Furthermore, Burney's admiration of Pacchierotti's musical talents was rewarded with respect for her taste and judgment. Susan Burney mentions several times in her journals when she will pay Pacchierotti a compliment on his singing, and he will respond to something to the effect of, coming from you, that's a real compliment because I know you know what you're hearing. Whether Susan Burney and Pacchierotti shared more than mutual admiration is in doubt, but their attraction to each other was clearly based as much on music as on personality. Burney's journals reveal that she was as devoted to and as protective of her idol Pacchierotti as any fan could be. Next slide. Quote, he is such a singer that really, if I ever again have the misfortune to meet with people who do not feel his merit, I shall despise them too much to think it worthwhile to attempt answering them. Susan Burney and her opera-loving female friends also engaged in disputes over their favorite stars in a way that obsessed opera lovers will recognize, thoughtfully and sensitively balancing connoisseurship and enthusiasm. These friends included Lady Mary Coke, Susanna Ogle, and Francesca Castle, as well as Lady Clarges, who at one point expressed a desire to choke David Garrick on Pacchiarotti's behalf after a dispute between the singer and Garrick when Garrick was managing the King's Theatre. Susan Burney was no less enthusiastic, describing Pacchiarotti's singing of an aria by Antonio Sacchini, originally composed for Giuseppe Milico. Next slide, please. Susan says, it is so affecting, so beautiful a composition that Fanny her sister, did not exaggerate when she wrote me her rapturous account of it at Worcester. And Pacchiarotti so sung it. I, who never heard Milico in it, can conceive nothing more exquisitely pathetic. Fanny and Lady Clarges, however, who both adore Pacchiarotti, prove that every singer should, if possible, sing such airs as have not been heard before, for they cannot forget Milico in it, end quote. Now, before we move to the final section where I want to talk about this relationship between Luigi Marchesi and Mariah Cosway, I want to play a musical excerpt for you, which is from this disc. If I could have the next slide. This is from this disc recording arias for Luigi Marchesi, which was put together by Stefano Aresi, who did an incredible amount of research to bring this together with his orchestra Stile Galante and the wonderful Swedish mezzo-soprano Anne Hollenberg, who sings these arias for Marchesi with ornamentation by Marchesi himself. And his manuscript scores have survived with his own markings in of ornamentation. And in fact, on this disc, there are two different versions of this same aria with two completely different sets of ornaments. And I want us to hear the music. This is from Alessandro Nell'Indie. This is a libretto by Pietro Metastasio, that had been written in the 1730s and had been set by many composers throughout the 18th century. And if you see the next slide, I have the text of the aria. He's torn between various things. He's not being Alexander the Great. He's being Poro or Porus, the king of India. And he is, at first he expresses sort of pathetic feelings in a slow section. This is in a rondo form for those of you familiar with it and familiar with rondo arias from Mozart operas. You have a slow section. He's singing pathetically to his beloved, but also addressing his sister, who I hasten to add is a different person. This is not Wagner. This is something else. And then the later part of the aria is a quick tempo where he becomes fiery. So here is Marchesi being both not just all fire, but some feeling and some fire with, as you'll hear, some very, very lavish ornamentation, which is very typical of the period, more so even than we're used to hearing in music like this today. So we because of the technical issues here, we have to listen to the aria a little bit separately, but Maisie is able to pull it up, and so I want you to hear the aria and experience what it would be like, something of what it would be like to listen to Luigi Marchesi sing an aria. So if you would, please, Maisie.
La
So as you can hear, there's quite a lot of extravagant ornamentation there, but the aria format is designed to show off everything that the singer can do. Pathetic singing, fiery singing, ornamentation everywhere. It's meant to be dazzling and moving by turns or even at the same time. So next slide, please. The confluence of musical artistry with physical beauty and charisma can only have contributed to Marchesi's star power, and evidence exists for his seductive sway among his female fans in particular. If I could have the next slide. According to John Rosselli, the ladies of Milan formed a kind of Marchesi fan club, wearing ribbons with his initials around their waists. Rebecca Jones, who wrote a wonderful dissertation on Marchesi's career, quotes a story told by Rodolfo Celletti that the ladies of Vienna wore medallions of Marchesi, some of them sporting a number of them at one time, one for each arm, one on the neck, and two for the buckles of their shoes. I think it puts the t-shirt wearing fans of today's superstars to shame. Excuse me. Next slide, please. As much as any star castrato, Mariah Hadfield Cosway had something of a peripatetic life herself. Born Mariah Hadfield in 1760 to British parents living in Florence, she was highly skilled and trained both as a visual artist and as a musician. She was a singer, could play the harpsichord and the harp. In 1779, she moved to London, and 2 years later, she married the artist Richard Cosway. The couple lived at Schomburg House in Pall Mall, becoming the center of a highly cultivated coterie of visual artists, musicians, and fashionable patrons. Domestic concerts at the Cosway's residence featured, among others, castrato stars including Giusto Tenducci, Giovanni Rubinelli, and Luigi Marchesi. The Cosways also spent time in Paris, where they again moved in high social and cultural circles. Next slide, please. Among their acquaintances was Thomas Jefferson, representative of the American rebels and future president of the United States. Jefferson and Mariah seem to have been particularly close, leading to a great deal of speculation about the precise nature of their relationship. Their respective biographers are still divided as to whether they were actually lovers or not, but the letters that survive, there are a few from Mariah to Thomas and quite a few more from him to her. And they're intensely feeling letters, including, if I could have the next slide, there's a letter that Jefferson wrote to Mariah Cosway on October 12, 1786, which is referred to often as the head and heart letter, in which part of it is a dialogue between his head and his heart. Between his heart is saying, "Oh, but I love her," and his head is saying, "But she's married, and behave yourself." And it's an interesting letter. It also includes quite a lot of sort of a disquisition on one of Jefferson's favorite topics, which is architecture. not exactly you might not think of it as sort of a Captain Wentworth, you pierce my soul level of romance to be talking about architecture. But I think it's important, first of all, to remember that Mariah's brother was an architect, and also that this indicates a kind of shared love of the arts between them, that it was undoubtedly contributed to the intensity of their relationship. In fact, this head and heart letter was Jefferson enclosed with it a copy of an aria from Antonio Sacchini's opera Dardanus, which the two of them had heard in Paris not long before then. So their love of music, their love of the arts is one of the reasons that attracted them to each other. It wasn't just physical attraction. And once again, it's engaging your mind and your emotions and your desires all at the same time. Next slide, please. Even before moving to England, Mariah Cosway had acted as a kind of talent scout, recommending singers to the King's Theatre management. Of course, she was still Mariah Hadfield then. Her recommendations indicate that she was susceptible to the physical attractions of castrati as well as the beauty of their singing, implying that she assumed that King's Theatre audiences would agree. Writing to Ozias Humphrey in 1776, Mariah says of the castrato Rubinelli that, quote, his appearance cannot be praised enough, being the most beautiful I have ever seen. His voice is the most beautiful that it is possible to hear, end quote. Significantly, Cosway first praises Rubinelli's looks before mentioning his voice. Again, her assessment of him might have arisen from her own proclivities or her awareness that physical attractiveness would be an important factor for the singer's success in London. Next slide, please. Although Cosway's biographer Gerald Barnett dismisses out of hand any implication that Cosway and Marchesi's relationship could have been sexual and states that there was simply a meeting of minds between them, I think an erotic attraction and even an erotic or sexual relationship cannot be ruled out. Cosway was an unabashed admirer of Marchesi from the time of his London debut in 1788, writing, in fact, to Thomas Jefferson shortly after Marchesi's first appearance. She described the castrato as the most wonderful singer she had ever heard and claimed that the rest of the singers were tiresome by comparison. A degree of attraction between Cosway and Marchesi was certainly the subject of gossip at the time. The Morning Post noted that on at least one occasion, Marchesi, quote, went into the same box with the seductive artist and remained there in tender homage till his theatrical duties called him to the stage, end quote. Cosway's well-known love of opera, combined with sexist assumptions about the inherent promiscuity of professional women, contributed to a good deal of gossip that she was too partial to the enchanting powers of Marchesi, end quote. Barnett quotes various reports from the Morning Post that include undoubted double entendres just beyond the breach of libel, stating, for instance, that Cosway, quote, has taken a whole length of Marchesi more successfully than any other artist in this country, end quote. Now, the use of this stock phrase, to take a whole length, to describe the creation of a full-length portrait, in this instance, I think probably had sexual connotations as well. The Morning Post included another item regarding the 1789 production of Luigi Cherubini's opera Iphigenia and Aulide, in which the Cosways are described as helping to design the costumes for the leading singers, Richard attiring the prima donna Cecilia Giuliani, and, quote, the fair Mariah decorating the person of the accomplished Marchesi, end quote, perhaps implying that the Cosways dressed these two singers after having undressed them. Next slide. No, I think leave this on. Sorry. That Mariah Cosway experienced a degree of unhappiness in her marriage and sought emotional connections outside it seems certain. Not only was Richard a serial adulterer, he also frustrated Mariah's artistic ambitions. Now, next slide, please. As Mariah herself put it, quote, had Mr. C allowed me to paint professionally, I should have made a better painter, but left to myself by degrees, instead of improving, I lost what I had brought from Italy of my early studies, end quote. Unfortunately, I'm not showing you any of Mariah's own work in this talk, but you can see a lot of it online. And I mean, it all looks great to me, but, you know, I'm not the artist, so she would have more exacting standards. Next slide, please. The birth of Cosway's daughter in May 1790 was, as she later confessed, a difficult one. Her sudden departure from London only a few weeks later, as I mentioned, excited a considerable comment at the time. Mariah's own later statement of her motives does not mention Marchesi, her motives for leaving England. Rather, she says very laconically, quote, the physician's agreed change of air, end quote. Cosway had long disliked the London climate and desired to return to Italy, and some degree of postpartum depression may also have influenced her decision, but of course it's impossible to prove that. If Mariah Cosway and Luigi Marchesi indeed traveled together, they could have had profound personal reasons for doing so, even if whether they were lovers or not. Martha Feldman notes that castrati, like today's superstars, often traveled with a small entourage of family members, friends, servants, and assistants. As procreation was generally thought at the time to be the main purpose of marriage, it was illegal virtually everywhere in Europe for castrati to marry. Nevertheless, the castrati often created sort of chosen families with surrogate parents, teachers, patrons, and other mentors, as well as surrogate siblings. When she traveled with Marchesi, Cosway had only recently become a mother and had left her child behind. Perhaps the idea of being part of a family of choice appealed to her as well. Could their connection also have been based on shared or complementary artistic sensibilities? Cosway was, as I mentioned, a talented musician as well as a celebrated artist. Given her frustrations over her artistic career in London, she may have felt that a return to the wellspring of her artistic education would revive her imagination. It is also entirely possible that inspiration relied to some degree on Marchesi's fire, and that the singer, as well as her architect brother, made her feel more respected than she had been in London. Perhaps we should think of Mariah Cosway less as a love-struck groupie than as a talented and intelligent woman who felt rejuvenated by an intimacy based on shared artistic sensibilities. Mariah Cosway returned to London in 1792, while Marchesi remained on the continent, never to visit Britain again. Mariah and Richard seem to have enjoyed a reconciliation enhanced by their shared delight in their daughter. Tragically, Louisa Cosway died in 1796 at the age of 6, to the devastation of both her parents. Mariah apparently threw herself into her work, going on to work in London and Paris before returning to Italy permanently after her husband's death in 1821. There seems to be no further surviving correspondence or evidence of any continuing relationship with Luigi Marchesi. In any case, the castrato was doomed, and it would be many years before London would hear another important castrato. As a kind of coda to this talk, I wanted to mention a couple of things. One, since we're talking about Jane Austen and company, and if I could have the next slide. Could Jane Austen have ever heard a castrato? I have no definitive one way or the other, but my guess is probably not, partly because Italian opera would have been out of the Austen family's pocketbook, let's say, and because really between 1790 and 1825, after Austen's death, no major castrato was heard in Britain. However, next slide, please. Austen may have seen or encountered or even have met a castrato, Venanzio Rauzzini, whose name I mentioned earlier this evening. Rauzzini had been a castrato singer. He was in the early 1770s. In Milan, he encountered the young Mozart. Mozart composed the leading man role in his opera Lucio Silla for Rauzzini, and more famously, Mozart composed for Rauzzini his famous motet Exultate Jubilate with its famous Alleluia. Rauzzini made his London debut at the King's Theatre in 1774, but gradually gave up singing for composing, conducting, teaching, and organizing concerts. And Rauzzini organized the Winter Concert Series in Bath from the mid-1780s until his death in 1810. So while the Austen family was living, the Austen women and the Reverend George Austen were living in Bath from 1801 to 1805. I have no doubt that Austen heard a concert conducted by Rauzzini, but he was no longer singing by then. At least that's what's indicated by the incredible amount of amazing research that Paul F. Rice has done in reconstructing the programs for all of these Bath concerts during Rauzzini's tenure. And just to add to the irony, as I mentioned, and kind of last major castrato to appear in London or anywhere did not appear in London until 1825. Next slide. 1825 was the year of that the last great operatic castrato, Giovanni Battista Velluti, made his London debut. Pretty much everything I know about Velluti I owe to two great scholars, J.Q. Davies and especially Robert Crowe, who is a male soprano as well as a musicologist and who wrote his dissertation on Velluti in London. By this time, the castrato was more controversial than ever. Felix Mendelssohn heard and encountered Velluti in London in 1829 and was pretty much freaked out by both experiences. But Velluti also had his fans, particularly among fashionable British society. As you can see in the next slide, this cartoon by back up. There we go. Thank you. J.L. Marx, which is called An Italian Singer Cut Out for English Amusement, or Signor Velluti Displaying His Great Parts. So this, of course, the cut out and the great parts are all kind of snickering references to castration. The crowd includes a very fashionable group. One woman is saying to another, "Do you not think he's a well-made man?" To which the other woman replies, "Yes, but not exactly the thing being what you think it might is." Further along, you see behind these two ladies is a man in a red military uniform with a sort of aquiline nose, whom Davies identifies as the Duke of Wellington, who was a big Velluti fan. And then further behind them, sort of towards the back, is a man in a blue coat, whom Crowe identifies as Lord Burghersh, who was the British ambassador to Florence and a very talented amateur composer. And next to him would be his wife, Lady Burghersh, who is expounding in sort of fangirl fashion. She's saying, "La, how delicious it he strains. It's enough to melt the heart of a stone." So there's a fangirl for you. And in fact, one more fangirl that I have. Next slide, please. A big fan of Velluti was Mary Shelley, who was scornful of her compatriots' squeamishness and snarkiness toward the castrato, an attitude that Shelley thought provincial. Both Robert Crowe and Gillen Darcy Wood argue that it's not surprising that the author of Frankenstein would want to humanize someone that others might view as an unnatural monster. In fact, interestingly, female devotion to androgynous or gender-fluid performers has not disappeared. Take, for example, next slide, please, the fat-bottomed girls celebrated, if that's the right word, in Queen's 1978 song of that name. Written by Brian May and performed by Queen's lead singer, Freddie Mercury, who was bisexual, the lyrics describe female fans as making the rockin' world go round, but still celebrate the groupies' devotion to the sexual comfort of the performers rather than the girls' own musical sophistication and sensibility. Perhaps if today's performers were more attentive, they might discover more Susan Burney's and Mariah Cosway's among their audiences than they might have imagined. Next slide, please. And thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Jeff. That was great.
Yes, I'm swooning over here.
So I want to remind our audience, please submit your questions for Jeff. We're going to enter into a period of Q&A. You can share questions in the comments feature on YouTube, or you can email us at info@janeaustenandco.org. And we would love to hear from audience members, questions, comments, thoughts, all of the above.
I have a question I don't know if I have the vocabulary for, but I started thinking about what you were talking about, Jeff, with Jane Austen and the fact that she probably wasn't going to opera, partly or largely because of the cost. But what about her music collection is part of my question.
Sure.
And the other part is, did the castrati cross over ever from singing opera to other kinds of singing? So was there like a popular versus opera musical world that they could have participated in?
Sure, both great questions. Obviously, Gillian Dooley is the expert on Jane Austen's music books, but there are operatic excerpts certainly in Austen's music books. How she knew of them, don't forget that there was sheet music that was made available through lending libraries, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Andrea Coelti and I have written about this in our Divas in the Drawing Room article in Persuasions Online of a few years back, but how available a lot of these arias and these music were. We know from from Austen's own novels that the Bingley sisters can sing Italian, Anne Elliot understands Italian. Of course, Jane Fairfax sings in Italian, and so these works would have been known. And so how Austen may not necessarily have gone to the Italian opera, we know she saw at least one English language opera, which actually leads into your second question, is this letter in 1813 where Jane writes to Cassandra and is talking about they went to the Theatre Royal Covent Garden where English language opera was given and more popular forms of entertainment. And she saw a performance of Thomas Arne's Artaxerxes, which was an English attempt to do an Italian opera seria in English. And by Austen's day, the male roles that were written for treble voices would have been sung by women in Artaxerxes. But originally, when the opera premiered in whatever year it was, 1762, I want to say, something like that, or 64, that those roles were sung by castrati. So castrati did sing in English language opera sometimes. They sometimes rarely sang in comic opera as opposed to serious opera. And they also sang a lot in oratorio and concerts. So they would have been heard in a lot of different venues. And you can see the music, when their music was published, their hit tunes were published, it will say, as performed by Signor Pacchierotti at the Pantheon. And it's, this adorable little English song. Rossini wrote and sang a lot of English language sort of, these kind of more, I hate to say folk-like songs, but you know what I mean, this kind of much more sort of popular music. So there was some crossover, certainly. But still, when Austen was in her maturity for most of her life, castrati just weren't around anymore. They just weren't performing in anywhere in the way that they had been previously.
Was that a decision that was made, or was it just that kind of shifting of taste?
I think it's a general trend. I think it's part of a general trend, and there was such a long gap between Marchesi leaving and Velluti arriving. 35 years. I mean, there's a whole generation of people who had never heard a castrato. And by that time, people are it's a whole different mindset. There's a caricature of this too, where Velluti on stage would wear, a mustache and a little goatee, fake beard, because audiences are now expecting men who look like men. As opposed to, and a castrato with that lack of testosterone would not be able to grow facial hair in that same way. So I think it's just a whole lot of shifting attitudes that are just phasing the castrati out. And there was an awareness of it even at the time. There's an anecdote about two men meeting in the street. I don't remember if this is in Italy or London or where it was supposed to be. And it was sometime during the 1820s. And one says to the other, "Oh, how is your father doing? I hear he's not well." And the other man says, "Oh, well, unfortunately, he's dying. But excuse me, I have to go to the opera." And the first man says, "Your father's dying and you're going to the opera?" And the other man says, "Well, yes, Velluti is singing." There's this feeling of this is our last chance to hear a castrato in this kind of setting. There's this awareness that time has moved on. Now, castrati, as I mentioned, continued in these church choirs for quite a while. Mary Shelley would have heard the Sistine Choir, and she could have heard, church choirs in Italy that included castrati. The very last castrato in the Sistine Chapel, which I'm sure a lot in the audience know, Alessandro Moreschi made recordings in the early 20th century. And there's also a group, I can't remember what their name was, but there was a group of a sort of a chamber vocal group that also made recordings from the Vatican, and a couple of them are thought to be castrati as well. But so those are the only records we have of what we're pretty sure are castrato voices. But it was just a sort of broad cultural shift on a whole lot of levels.
Jeff, since you mentioned Jillian, I wanted to, she asked a question a few minutes ago that I wanted to share on the screen. So she asks, can you mention again the name of the researcher who looked at the Bath concerts?
Oh, yes. Yes, Jillian. Well, again, I feel like Pakirati speaking to Susan Burney Phillips, because if Jillian, if you enjoyed the talk, I feel very honored. Yeah, this was Paul F. Rice, has written a book about Rossini, and in the appendix he has the reconstruction of all of the concert programs. And it indicates that certainly by even the 1790s, Rossini was no longer singing at them, but he was apparently still conducting them, and his pieces were performed there very frequently. But it's an amazing amount of research that went into reconstructing these concert programs. In some cases, you don't know specifically what the piece was, because the newspaper will say, and so sang a song, or so and so played a concerto, and you don't know exactly what they are. But wherever possible, he's put all this together. It's an incredible resource.
Amazing.
Another question from the audience, Susan, sorry, that I wanted to display on the screen. How does the satire of the castrati compare to the general satire of the period? It struck me that in the case of castrati, satire made the voice visible. Can you comment?
Oh, I believe this is a friend of mine who would naturally ask a very challenging question. But yeah, I think the idea that satire made the voice visible. Yeah, if you're familiar with, of course, Rowlandson and Gilray and Cruikshank and all of those, and several of them in the same family very often, it's this idea of trying to capture and at the same time heighten and exaggerate the qualities of these individuals. And there's a certain the way in which, as I mentioned, Martha Feldman points out, there wasn't a single castrato body, and you see all of these different body types. She also, Feldman talks about this quite a bit. There are a lot of caricatures, especially in Italy in the middle of the century, which make the castrati literally look like animals. They are given a very animalistic features. They'll look like a fox or a pig, or and there's this idea of their sort of monstrousness is carried through a lot of these images. So and again, I don't understand the anatomy of it. I don't understand the physiology of what would make the bodies do that. But supposedly, the broad chests were, I've been told, although one doctor I talked to said that this was nonsense, so I defer to doctors, but that with the lack of testosterone, the rib cage would not harden as quickly as it usually would, and so the chests were able to expand, and they had this incredible lung power where they're singing incredibly long passages with a single breath. But at the same time, you get the sense that there was, we used to think, that everybody was just entranced with their voices, but not with their bodies. And what we're finding is that in certain cases, at least, the bodies were also considered very attractive. And again, it's this eternal boyishness. Freitas has written about, when you look at art of the period, you look at visual arts of the period, look at paintings by somebody like Giambattista Tiepolo in the mid-18th century, and you have these male heroes who are very tall with little heads. And that's a sort of ideal of beauty that goes back to the 16th century, at least to the late Renaissance. But Freitas argues, I think convincingly, that they look like castrati. This is their boyish, beardless faces on these sort of adult male bodies, but of a particular kind. And so I think it shouldn't be thought of as that's weird. It should be thought of as this was castrati often had this ideal body type that people were looking for in the 18th century. And so there's a whole range of reactions to their physical appearance. I don't know if that answers the question, my dear Kirsten, but that's the best I can do.
Well, here's another question about castrati. Joan Hasaka is asking if the church or the opera, which of those was the driving force initially for castrati?
Initially, it was the church. And this goes to because St. Paul said, let your women keep silence in churches, which is why you have the whole tradition of using choir boys and falsettists in the English tradition, for example, English choir tradition, rather than women. And so there's this, it started out in the mid 16th century with this idea of, oh, these boys have such beautiful voices, and it would be a shame to have them change. And there seems to be, in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, there seems to be a preference for treble voices. There were tenors and basses, and it certainly, but it's, every opera companies were generally structured as there is a primo uomo, the leading man, who was a castrato, and the prima donna, a woman, then a secondo uomo, second man, who was also a castrato, and a second woman, and then the tenor and bass are kind of at the lowest rung of this. They get the fewest arias. They're kind of considered the least interesting characters. So they love their treble voices, and so in the church they start castrating these boys to preserve their voices, and they start in church choirs. And then they sort of move on to the opera, and opera really, as we know it, was invented around the very late 16th century, first in Florence. And so it's by the 17th century, first in Italy and elsewhere, that it starts to spread. And so it's in the church first. And you would think that the church would be horrified by this and would ban it. And technically it was illegal. Charles Burney has a very funny passage that everybody quotes when they write about castrati, which is, he went looking for the places where they did the castration. And he said, I can't remember exactly, but it's like in Rome, they told me to go to Bologna. In Bologna, they told me to go to Venice. And in Venice, they told me it was in Naples. And, it's obviously everybody's passing the buck and say, well, we don't do it here. One theory is that it was very common in Bologna because of, as you know, if you've been to Bologna, they're famous for their meats, and there are a lot of butchers around there who would know how to slice. That's one theory. So yeah, but it's like everything else. It's like astrology and all these other things. In theory, the church is opposed to it, but in practice, they let it happen. And as I mentioned, I think Feldman is right that they were seen as being like angels, or they were seen as being like sort of like priests, in that they were celibate, not entirely by choice.
Sort of asexualized.
In a way, yes, but at the same time sexualized by their fans and admirers. So it's this very complicated thing.
We've got two follow-up audience questions that dovetail off of this nicely, and then we'll go back to some of the other ones from earlier. Christina Papp asks, 4,000 a year is a lot of boys who are castrated with the hope of becoming famous singers. What happened to those who didn't become famous? Do we know?
No, that's a very good question. Again, a lot of them ended up in church choirs. A lot of them ended up becoming priests. I should mention almost every castrato that we know of pretty much was Italian. It was not done elsewhere. There was, in fact, we saw an image of him in one of the caricatures. There was a castrato named Antonio Berenstadt, who sang a lot in London in the 1720s and sang operas by Handel and others. But his name is German, but he was raised in Italy his father was a German musician who had settled in Italy. So there were always Italians. And but some of them became composers, some of them entered into holy orders, some of them lost their voices. Actually, you might think it's a little bit on the trashy side, but Anne Rice wrote this novel called Cry to Heaven, which is about castrati. And one of them is castrated as a boy and then loses his voice, and he becomes a composer because of that, because you have to find something to do.
You've kind of answered Mary McCauley's question. Were any notable castrati prominent in other arts as well? Anything outside of music, or is it kind of composing?
Outside of music, I don't know of. If anybody knows different, let me know. But I don't know that they went into other arts. Music was their life, and it was sort of like, you had no choice but to spend your life in music after having gone through that. And so they were either became composers or church organists, or they were teachers, or music teachers. In Naples, there were 4 large conservatories that churned out a lot of incredibly talented composers, instrumentalists, and singers, especially castrati. And so I really don't know of any of them. I know of it's rare even for any singer in the 18th century that I know of to go into other arts. Some did. I mean, there was a Scottish tenor named Alexander Gordon who gave up singing and became an antiquarian, and studied antiquities, and then came to North America, and I'm sorry to say, bought, I think, like I can't remember, it was some kind of a plantation in South Carolina. So became a slaveholder, unfortunately. But for most of these musicians, and music often was a family business. I mean, Farinelli's brother was a composer. Many of these, this was their life, really. And so if you didn't sing anymore, didn't want to, or couldn't sing anymore, you would compose or teach or do something. But again, a lot of them did become priests and go into, that's about as far as it went, as far as I know.
We have Jean Kleiber, who would like you to talk a little bit about ornamentation in music. How was it just the higher fluttering portions? Can you talk a little bit about how that works?
Well, again, I'm not a music historian, so let me try to explain it. It's not just the higher sections, but if you listen to that whole aria, on practically everywhere, she doesn't just sing a note; she trills on it. She does a running scale. There are these little turns and little fluctuations back and forth, and these little triplet figures, and everything. It's not just a straight musical line. It's everything is embellished, and they were considered embellishments, which coming from Latin or Italian, meaning to make it more beautiful. And the assumption is that the more ornamented it is, the more ornate it is, the more extravagant it is, the more beautiful it is. And so your ability to sing a variety of ornaments, your ability to come up with your own ornaments, your ability to sometimes improvise them on the spot, was all considered part of your musical training. But it's the idea of just singing a straightforward line that had an appeal too, especially as the century wore on. But a lot of that it's all of that, all of that decoration is very much a part of the aesthetic of this kind of music.
And sometimes the composer would write in ornamentation, right? And then other times just leave a kind of plain line. Like I know Mozart did that a lot.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Filled in.
Yeah, and singers were expected, and it's important to stress that the singer was, generally speaking, the singer was more important than the composer at this point. That the composers were generally, and this is an oversimplification. You have some composers like Handel, for instance, who could be very assertive about, no, you're singing my music my way. But even Handel, the composer's job was to set the singer off in the best possible way. So you write music that will show off what that particular singer can do best. And I don't have an exact number, just wildly saying somewhere between 90 and 99% of the music that these singers sang in the 18th century was written for them. It's very unusual, as with the case we had earlier, where Susan Burney is saying, "Oh well, I love the way Pacchiarotti sings this aria, but my sister and Lady Clarges liked the way Milico did it." But generally speaking, you sang what was written for you because the composer had to fit the music like a glove to your particular talents. And so, and this again, these singers were well trained not only in singing but also in composition and counterpoint and all those things. So that they often composed. Marchesi composed, and you had to, composing your own ornaments was a part of that same skill.
Thanks. That's great.
I think we have time for one more question, and I wanted to get Abigail Thompson's question up here. She also made a comment about an SNL skit involving Ariana Grande, which I hadn't seen that one, I don't think. But Abigail asks, so in Austen's time, would there have been pants parts for women, and would they have literally worn pants for them? Just thinking about, I guess, gender a little bit further.
Yeah, the answer is yes. All throughout the 18th century, there were male characters often sung by female singers. Some female singers almost made a specialty of doing that, and that lasted into the early 19th century or even beyond. And yes, there are a lot of that. And also another favorite thing in 18th century opera and Baroque opera is the female character sung by a woman who spends most of their time dressed as a man for some reason or other. But yeah, this was considered very exciting because when you had a beautiful woman with shapely legs, like the Italian soprano Faustina Bordoni was famous for the beauty of her figure, and she loved to play characters of women, always women, not men, but women who were disguised as men for some reason, so she could wear. And usually they're wearing these very elaborate costumes, very ornate and pagnate skirts and pagnate sort of kilts for the men, and Roman armor with helmets and this kind of thing, but be able to see their legs. But yeah, they would wear tights or something of that nature. And that's a tradition. There's a whole separate tradition of French travestis, women playing male characters, especially young boys. And that carries over into the 19th century as well. But by the 19th century, and Heather Hadlock and Naomi Andre talk about this, this development, this shift from the treble-voiced male as being the leading man, castrato, the leading man played by a woman, and then the sort of page boy, kid brother character that you get later on in the 19th century. And so that's a whole separate tradition.
So would Cherubino in Mozart's Marriage of Figaro be a part for a castrati or a part for a woman?
It was written for a woman. Well, interestingly, in the original play, when Beaumarchais published the play, The Marriage of Figaro, and he names all the characters and describes their costumes and their personalities. And he says about Cherubin or Cherubino that it would be better to be played by a woman, even in a spoken play, because men lack the sensitivity to play the character, which is an interesting statement. But it was written for a woman and usually sung by a woman, although in recent years, a couple of countertenors have taken on the part, including Robert Crowe apparently sang it, and more recently, I think Mayan Licht, who is a countertenor, sang the role of Cherubino. But usually it's done by a woman and was originally conceived to be performed by a woman rather than a castrato. I think Mozart he wrote several operas that involved castrati, including most of his serious operas. But Cherubino would have been sung by a woman, generally.
Cool. Wow. Thank you so much, Jeff. This has been an amazing talk, and I've thoroughly enjoyed our time together. If you're still in the crowd, please give Jeff a round of applause for this event.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you to everyone who's in attendance tonight. We really appreciate all of your support. As we start to wrap things up, please don't log off just yet. We have a few announcements to share. So I'm going to turn things over to Susan.
Our next event will take place on March 6th, when we'll hear from Gillian Dooley, who will be with us from Australia, on Jane Austen's musical life. And we've been proud of our ability through the last many years to maintain a pay what you can format, because we recognize that not everyone may be in a financial position to pay to attend our events. If you're able, though, please consider supporting our programming by donating either on our website or through the link we're sharing right now. It really makes a huge difference. We want to keep Jane Austen and Company as widely available as possible, and donations are how we're able to do that. Even a few dollars can help make a big difference. So thank you for your continued support. A donation to the Jane Austen Collaborative helps us fund free online lecture series, quality teaching programming, and in-person summer programs. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization.
All right, and just as a reminder, this event, it's been recorded. It's going to be available on our website basically immediately afterwards. So you can head to janeaustenandco.com or .org to watch this recording again. I think there's a lot that Jeff shared that is you can kind of chew on and think about further. So this is a talk that I'm excited to go back and rewatch in the not too distant future. Our website has now something like 40 or 50 different recorded episodes. We have episodes on a range of series. We just wrapped up Austen and Bronte's earlier this year. We have the many flavors of Austen as well. So if you're interested in anything as from like folk music adaptations of Pride and Prejudice to virtual tours of Jane Austen's house, our website is a great place to visit. So that's all we have for tonight. Thank you again, Jeff. We really appreciate you kicking off our series on music in the Regency. This was great.
Thank you very much. It's been
wonderful.
A pleasure.
It's a lot to think about. You're right. Thank you so much.
Have a good evening, everybody. Until next time.